What is going on? That is the big question we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, a momentous 24 hours in Westminster. Rishi Sunak has called a general election for July the 4th. What is he thinking? Why has he done it? What do the polls say? What are we looking out for? We're just going to be reacting as a team to some of what we've seen in the last, as I say, in the last 24 hours. And to do that, I am joined by two of my favourite people to talk about politics with, Cameron.garrett and Holly.day. Guys, how are we feeling?
Morning, Kieran. Feeling good. It was a busy day yesterday recovering.
It was a busy day. It's going to be busy 6 weeks.
Yeah. How are you feeling? You were quite excited early on yesterday.
Well, you know what? In a rare show of foresight, I do feel like if I'm going to sort of pat myself on the back a bit, I think I saw it coming quite early. It felt like, for the first time, it's easy to say now because it's obviously happened, but it felt like for the first time there was a coherent idea behind why there was going to be an election. This idea of, we've got a plan, it's working. Labour doesn't have a plan. That sort of messaging, and you saw that very strongly, I think, in Rishi Sunak's statement that was somewhat drowned out in more ways than one. But yeah, so I think it was a dramatic day. It's a funny one. We prepare for these things, don't we, for such a long time, and then it comes, and all of a sudden it's a bit crazy. But yeah, I mean, Holly, what do you reckon? Were you surprised?
I think I spent most of yesterday in a state of shock. It's fair to say. Traveling down to London for various things. It was the perfect time to arrive, I think, and be in the action. I think I was, until he actually announced it as being July, I still thought there was a possibility he might do a speech and announce it for November. Like, I just thought November was pretty nailed on. I mean, I guess the news of this week, the economic news about inflation reducing, obviously our economic optimism index showed improvements in people's kind of outlook for the next 12 months in thinking the economy is going to potentially get better. I think that's possibly the sort of thing that triggered it. Maybe they thought it wasn't going to get much better than that in terms of outlook and news on their side. I still think, given the way the polls are looking on all of the measures that we track on both the Conservative Party and Sunak's personal ratings, yeah, until he'd literally, the moment he announced it, I just thought it can't happen. There were so many people coming up to us in the office, weren't they, going, why is he doing it now? We've literally just released our political monitor with some still pretty bad numbers for the government, right?
I'm with Holly. I was kind of dead cert. November 14th, whenever anyone asked me, I was like, that's the date. I didn't really get why he'd want to surprise anyone. Like, why would he want to surprise the Labour Party? They know an election's coming. They're going to be prepared to push a button when they want to. But actually, yesterday, for me, the penny dropped. Like, he might not, like, Labour might be ready, but he can surprise Reform, who are on his flank, and we kind of saw that in the locals where Reform were standing. They were taking votes off the Conservatives, and by going early, he's kind of deprived them of the summer to prepare. I think they've got around 500 candidates at the minute, from what I've seen on being floated about on Twitter. So they haven't got one in every seat yet. Nigel Farage is still kind of, is he going to come back? Isn't he? He's kind of cut that short, like, make a decision, Nigel. We're going to the polls. And that's something I hadn't really thought about till yesterday. And it kind of was like, well, that does make sense to me.
Yeah, and I think I remember when you said that, I was absolutely spot on. I think it is a real variable in this election, what Reform does. We had John Curtis on this podcast, didn't we, a few weeks ago after the local elections. And he made very, very clear that where Reform stood in the local elections, I think the Tory vote share was down 18 points or something like that. And I think where they didn't, it was down 11. And it just obviously local elections different to a general election, but it sort of backs up what we know in the opinion polls, which is that Reform take a large chunk of their support from the Conservative Party. So anything that can neuter that, both logistically, as you point out, but also in terms of not having a summer of votes as well. I suppose the risk for the Tories is that it backfires and that Nigel Farage thinks that, well, maybe I fancied swanning around America in October supporting Trump, and now that's not compromised anymore. I can just go all in for 6 weeks and try and cause as much problem for the Conservative Party as possible. But I suppose it remains to be seen. I mean, what do we think about how's Labour going to be feeling today? I mean, obviously they're ahead in the polls, aren't they? But they'll say they were prepared. But Do you think this is a good thing for them, or would they have rather it gone long?
I mean, they announced their 6 steps to government like a week ago. So they've got missions in place. They've got baby steps in place. At some point, they're going to have a manifesto in place, right? Like the extent to which those things are kind of written is another interesting thing over the next few weeks for the bulk of the policy announcements to come. I think that's the thing that we've been missing from Labour, and I think we expected to see over the summer. We're now going to have to see that very, very quickly. Despite that, though, given the kind of 20-point lead we're seeing in the polls, I'm not sure the extent to which these sorts of things are going to change the dial for normal people, and the extent to which, even if it did change the dial, is it going to change the dial enough? We've seen Starmer's ratings in our latest political monitor improving from kind of net -31 to net -18, as we discussed the other day. His numbers were going in the right direction and had turned a corner. The public are kind of ready for a change. I think they seem to have been just wanting it to happen and happen quickly for the messages that Starmer's been giving at PMQs for the past 6 months. So they've got what they asked for. They've now just got to deliver on the policies and the manifestos, kind of flesh out what it would all look like.
I think, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but I think the next week of polling is just going to be so fascinating and so important because, one of the numbers in our most recent political monitor, which we don't really emphasize that much, but it's around half still that say they might change their minds before the next general election. And I think the point there is, it doesn't mean that they all will, but I think the point there is that, for most quote unquote normal people who wants to be normal, but most normal people don't follow this stuff on a day-to-day basis. We were sitting there in a meeting room making notes on Sunak's speech and about how he was talking about security and it was plan versus no plan and all this sort of stuff. And he was talking about his role in the pandemic and all these sorts of messages. But most people that I was on WhatsApps with or whatever that don't follow politics very closely just talked about him getting wet. And this is, it wasn't the best optics, let's put it politely. But I think it does. This next week, when people start to engage with the fact that there's going to be an election that maybe don't engage on a sort of week-to-week basis, that's going to be really fascinating because we do know that there is, it sounds like a bit of a corporate word, but we do know that there's a lot of latent Tory support out there, that maybe Conservative voters who aren't sure they're going to show up, or people that voted Conservative last time that say they're undecided. And so will there be a bump in the polls, by 5 points or more for the Conservatives in the coming days or over the weekend, because that might change how the whole election's presented. But at the same time, if there isn't, then this could end up aging really badly, really quickly for Sunak. Cameron, what do you think?
Yeah, but I think as an industry, we've been talking about Tory don't knows for a year, 18 months, a long time. It's going to be interesting to see what happens to them. And yeah, I would expect the polls to tighten. But when you do have a 21-point lead, it's what it's going to tighten to. I imagine the media will get very excited if the polls do tighten. And a warning to them to not get too overexcited, please. Don't push that narrative too much if the Labour still do have a healthy lead. But I can imagine, hey, it's going to be hard not to. And kind of a very nerdy point in polling and a number we definitely don't emphasize that much is kind of our turnout filters. So how likely you are to say to vote, and you get into our voting intention by saying, yeah, I'm 10 out of 10 likely to vote. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that ticks over and whether we've got some of those 7, 8 started to creep into the 9 and 10s as this election is announced. And all of that will feed into perhaps a tightening in the polls.
Yeah, and I think the other important variable that I think most people understand is important, but I think can't be emphasized enough is Scotland. I mean, you still get this persistent narrative that Labour needs to win by 12 to 14 points to get a majority of one, and all. I think those days are behind us. We've seen with the changes in Scotland, with Labour gaining support there, with tactical voting in England, and generally just the efficiency of the Labour vote. It may well be that what ends up happening, and this isn't a prediction, it's kind of it's your central assumption going in, but we know things can change, is that it probably will narrow, but then actually, Labour winning a popular vote nationally by 8 to 10 points probably still gives them quite a chunky majority, much as it sort of did the other way around with Boris Johnson in 2019. So we really have to pay attention to what's going on in Scotland, and also bear in mind that actually the volume of polling you're going to get in Scotland is going to be considerably less than it's going to be in GB or British wide generally. And it's just really, really important to the sort of dynamics of things, isn't it?
There will definitely be some Ipsos polling. We're meeting up with our Scotland colleagues this morning to sort that out. So look forward to that throughout the campaign.
So let's wrap up this sort of emergency podcast a bit with just what we're kind of looking out for in the next week. What do we think are the key things to sort of pay attention to, Holly?
I think, as Cameron said, how in our next poll it's going to shift now an election has been called. I think we probably do expect to see a bit of a change, and the extent to which there is a change or a narrowing over the next few weeks will be super fascinating. Similarly, what starts happening to the smaller parties. Obviously, we've just kind of come out of the back of a local elections where a number of those parties performed quite well, and they've been polling quite well with us. You would expect potentially a bit of a squeeze on them as well. So just like that first poll that we're going to release on, since it's been announced how those numbers are changing, is going to be fascinating. And then I'm just looking forward to just like the stuff that crops up during a campaign, right? There'll be the standard stuff with the manifestos, with the debates, like the flagship events, but like things happen. So being able to track that over the next 6 weeks is going to be, it's going to be a really exciting time for us here, isn't it?
I think for me, the most immediate pressing question, it's not the only question that matters, but the most pressing question right now is, what does Nigel Farage do and what are Reform going to do? I mean, Cameron spoke about it earlier, but we know how much support they take away from the Conservatives. We know that Nigel Farage going all in, campaigning, leading that campaign for reform could really, really damage a Conservative Party that's already struggling. But if he doesn't, for whatever reason, he decides he's not going to stand as a candidate, or it just seems to sort of, shall we say, filter away in terms of the momentum that they frankly don't really have at the moment after the local elections, then it might be that actually that helps the Tories too, and they can start consolidating some of that reform support that they've lost in polling terms and in by-election terms in the last few months. So it's not the only thing that matters, but that's the most immediately pressing question for me, I think.
Yep, I'm very much looking forward to seeing actually how Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are as campaigners. We haven't really seen them in a general election kind of setting. And you've got to think, in 2017, if we were doing this podcast at the start, we'd be saying, well, the Tories are ahead, etc. Theresa May, awful campaigner. I'm not saying that's going to happen this time. I don't think Keir Starmer's quite that bad. So it's going to be interesting to see. And I think Rishi kind of had a rocky start yesterday in the rain. But yeah, interesting to see how that improves.
Well, let's leave it there. Let's leave it there for now. I mean, there'll be plenty of podcasts coming over the next few weeks. So please, viewers and listeners, do like, subscribe, share, and pay attention. We're going to be getting some external guests on to come and give their expertise, which should be always is a good time, and great to get other voices on the podcast. But for now, as ever, thank you to Holly.day and Cameron.garrett for joining me. And yeah, let's get going.